Sanding is a fundamental woodworking skill, so it's surprising how little some folks seem to know about it. And worse yet are the popular misconceptions that are spread online by folks who spend far more time debating woodworking theory online than they do just going out into the shop and doing it, because they would quickly find that some of the theories that they think up in their head don't always agree with actual practice. Take power sanding, for example. It's a great way to smooth a surface, but you should not do all of your sanding with the power tool, especially if the surface is going to be seen or touched when the project is done. The last grit to touch the project should always be powered by hand, moving with the grain to blend any remaining scratches into the natural texture of the wood. If you don't hand sand your final grit, eventually you're going to regret it when you get on your finish and it makes all the little swirls and pigtail scratches and other flaws that you missed with the power sander or that were created by the power sander now stand out like a sore thumb, and it's too late because the finish is already on it. That brings me to another misconception that directly relates to how we sand our projects. Not every surface has to be dead flat. Wood is a lifelike material, even after the tree is physically dead. The fibers expand and contract as the moisture in the air fluctuates. So even if you ran this across your jointer and through your thickness planer, and you got all these sides and edges perfectly flat and square, by the time you cut your joinery and you put your project all together, it is very unlikely that this surface is still going to be perfectly flat. Then you get out your power sander and you go over this with 1 or 2 or 3 grits, being a little more aggressive in different spots on the board to remove stubborn machine marks. And at that point, I can absolutely guarantee this board isn't flat anymore. Now, this is where some folks argue with me. I've been through this a bunch of times online with people. They say you should do your final hand sanding with a rigid sanding block, such as a piece of hardwood with sandpaper glued to it, because like a traditional hand plane, that flat block is going to make the surface of your board perfectly flat again, and that's what you want. The problem is, you're almost always doing your hand sanding with your finest grits, 180, 220, maybe even higher. That's not going to level things out very quickly. How much elbow grease do you want to spend making this surface perfectly flat again when it really doesn't matter? It doesn't matter because nobody's going to notice in the finished project. With the possible exception of a tabletop that's going to be covered in an ultra high gloss finish that's maybe always going to be sitting somewhere, it's going to have raking light across the top all the time, no one's going to notice if there are minor gradual variations in this surface. So don't fight what nature is just going to do anyway. When you hand sand a surface, you should use a sanding block that will conform to those minor variations. This will make the hand sanding process so much faster, easier, and more effective, so you're going to be willing to do it instead of going with power all the time. And I believe the best material to make a sanding block out of is cork. Cork is just firm enough to keep this surface reasonably flat, but also just soft enough to adapt to those minor variations. And the best part about cork is you can get this stuff dirt cheap. I discovered this secret a few years back when I was buying a yoga mat to use as a sanding pad, which, by the way, is a fantastic tip. I put down the yoga mat on the bench. It's got enough grip that the workpiece doesn't slide all over even when I'm using a power sander. I had it in a video some time ago. Try it out, seriously. But cork yoga blocks, which are often sold the same place you get the mats, can be bought for as little as 10 bucks a piece. I'll put a link to the ones I use below this video. Now, one 3-inch by 6-inch by 9-inch block can be cut into as many as 10 sanding blocks, depending on the thickness you prefer. I like mine extra thick, so I might get fewer, but that means like $1 a block for these things, and they last forever. Now, I use adhesive-backed sandpaper that I get in a roll on Amazon. I'll link to it if you want to check it out. Makes it way easy to put on the really fine grits of sandpaper. And honestly, this is one of the most comfortable, effective, and least expensive ways to hand sand a project that I've ever found. And remember, you're only doing this for your final fine grit. You're working with the grain, getting rid of those final scratches. I don't expect you to do all your sanding by hand with a cork block. That'd be crazy. But if you can do it with the cork on your final grit, it's going to make a huge difference in your projects. But here's the thing. There is a place for those rigid, flat sanding blocks, just not on the project's surfaces. Rigid sanding blocks are absolutely essential for squaring edges or ends or fine-tuning joinery, like miters and even tenons, things that used to be done with a hand plane, but are much easier for a lot of people with a sanding block. Now, if you've never tried this, this is going to change how you work. Get yourself a sanding block that has a surface that is perfectly 90 degrees to its side. You can make something like this yourself out of some hardwood if you mill it carefully. But there's a reason I prefer to buy mine, which I'll get to in a minute. Now, put a scrap of wood beneath your workpiece to raise it up off the bench. And your sanding block can then be used to ensure that that edge is perfectly straight and square, something that is critical in a lot of situations, such as when you'll be gluing the edges of several boards together to make a wider panel. This will eliminate gaps in your seams, even machine marks that can come off a jointer if you're using one of those. The same principle can be applied to the ends of workpieces, such as here, where I'm making a tiny, fine adjustment to a miter so that I get a gap-free joint. I even made a shooting board to guide one of my blocks so I can trim pieces by hand, then either square them up on the end at 90 or hone a perfect 45 by hand. It's a great little jig for trim work. It's nice and portable. I made a whole video about it a few years ago if you want to check it out. I'll link to that below. Like I said, you can make square sanding blocks out of hardwood yourself, but the ones I use are covered with carbide grit, which lasts for years. They're called Duragrit True Sander blocks, and they come in 4 different grits. I discovered them almost a decade ago when I was just browsing through a woodworking store. I decided to try one, and I never looked back. I recommend you try just one of these. I mean, eventually you're gonna want all 4 grits, but if you just wanna try one, get the 120 grits, the most versatile. I think that's the one I started with. You'll see why I eventually got them all. They have so many uses in the shop. They're really incredible. But understanding when to use rigid sanding blocks and when to use softer sanding blocks will really up your woodworking game. And now, in this short time that we've been talking, you have several great tips: how to get cheap, dirt cheap cork sanding blocks, how to use carbide sanding blocks, how to fine-tune your joinery with the sanding block, and don't forget about the yoga mat tip. That's a game changer too. So we'll see you next time.